And that's how I got all the stories I've been telling you. They came out of all the old newspapers. So I ended up finding the interesting, colorful history of the tunnel, but nothing about is it still there and how do you get inside, which was very frustrating. So one of the librarians said to me, why don't you go and ask the experts? They would know all about this thing, and that way you could just wrap it all up, and they could probably show you pictures of it when they were down there, and they must have found this 30 years ago, and you just don't know about it yet. So I said, okay, I'll talk to the experts. So the first expert I went to see was the guy who was the founder of the Transit Museum. So I said to him, hey, what's up with this tunnel under Atlantic Avenue? So he says to me, oh, there's no tunnel under Atlantic Avenue. And I said, what do you mean there's no tunnel under Atlantic Avenue? According to these maps there is. He goes, no, I can guarantee to you there's nothing under there. And I said, well, how do you know? And he says, well, when I was your age, I went looking for it and there's nothing there. So I said, wait a minute, back up for a second. What you're telling me is not that there isn't any tunnel, what you're telling me is not that there isn't any tunnel. What you're telling me is that you tried to find it, and because you can't find it, that means there's no tunnel. And he says, yeah, that's right. So I said, oh, well, you know, it sounds like there's a flaw with your logic stream over here. What if it just looked in the wrong place? He goes, oh, that couldn't happen. I don't make mistakes. So I said, okay, whatever. So I went on to the next expert. Now I talk to experts from city agencies, right? So the next guy I go to says to me, don't look for that tunnel, because if it's there, it's filled up with water 14 feet deep. And then the next expert I went to see said, don't look for that tunnel, because if it's there, it's filled up with exploding gas. And then the next expert I went to see said, don't look for that tunnel, because if it's there, it's filled up with poison gas and exploding gas. And then I went to the last expert, because after this last one, I couldn't tolerate talking to any more experts. So I go to this last guy, and he says to me, don't go in the tunnel, because if it's there, there's 5-foot rats inside, and they will eat you. So I actually have a letter on the city's letterhead from back in the early 1980s that says, don't go in that tunnel because you will be eaten by rats. So this is the last expert who I could tolerate talking to after this. And all these experts did by telling me these dopey stories is just made me more determined to go out and find the tunnel. So what ended up happening was pure dumb luck intercedes into this thing. And I walk into a bookstore at 6th Avenue and 8th Street to buy someone a birthday present. And I'm going through the aisle and I bump into a book that's hanging half out of the shelf. And it falls down and I pick it up and it says Old Brooklyn Heights by Clay Lancaster. So I'm like, oh, what's this thing? So I'm thumbing through the book and there's pictures of the old brownstones in Brooklyn Heights and pictures of the old-time people walking around Montague Street. And basically what this book is a reprint of the Landmarks Commission report from the 1960s that made Brooklyn Heights into a historic district. So I'm there, you know, thumbing through the book and reading the stories about the old people who lived here. And then I come to this page where there's this woodcut drawing of a really old-looking tunnel. And then in the woodcut drawing, it's a really old picture of there's a drawing of a really old train coming out the mouth of this really old tunnel. So, and it said, the caption says Atlantic Avenue Tunnel, 1844. So I'm like, oh, what do we have here? So I look in the back of the book in the index, and it cross-references to a newspaper article. It says Brooklyn Daily Eagle, July 23rd, 1911. So I went out to the microfilm the next day, and without this book, I never would have found it because my research only went from the 1830s to the 1880s. Well, who would think to look in 1911? So I went and looked up the newspaper from 1911, and there's a full-page story entitled "Brooklyn has the world's oldest subway," and it goes on to say in the first paragraph how there's no place like this tunnel that's abounding with old inhabitants' tales and folklore the way this tunnel is. Which is perfectly true. For example, in 1893, the New York Times wrote a story about the problem they were having with piracy here in New York Harbor. And they said the worst gang of river pirates in New York Harbor had their headquarters in a bar room in Atlantic Avenue near the waterfront. And they said they were using this old train tunnel as their Aladdin's cave for their treasure. And there was so much gold and silver in this tunnel that you didn't need a torch to go inside. It just glowed in the dark. And then it went on to say that the secret entranceway into this tunnel was guarded by 2 7-foot-tall Turks with scimitars. So that's the types of stories that were floating around about this tunnel. And then the story from 1911 talked about bootleggers having shootouts down here, which turned out to be real, by the way. They had stories about smugglers hiding things down here. And, you know, then in 1936 there was an article in the New York Times saying that the police were trying to find their way into this tunnel because they got an anonymous tip that Meyer Lansky was dumping dead bodies from Murder Incorporated down in this tunnel. But they couldn't find a way in. You know why? It said they were looking for the secret entranceways from the bars that the pirates used to use, and there weren't any. But they must have had a good time doing the Atlantic Avenue bar crawl for 12 blocks. So that's the kind of stories floating around about this tunnel, which go to the heart of what makes it valuable. Besides being something that could potentially be a transportation asset, and it already is a historical asset, it has all these stories attached to it. That's where the real value is. Now, getting back to the story with me, after I found this book and found that newspaper article from 1911, the most important thing in this 1911 newspaper article was they showed a cross-sectional drawing of a map that they had found from 1868. And it showed the roof of the tunnel in relationship to the street surface in different locations. So I said to myself, wow, the way the roof of this tunnel is set up, I bet there's a spot where the roof of the tunnel is so close to the surface of the roadway that any manhole in the area would have to go inside of it. Now remember when you came down through the ladder, the roof of the tunnel was like a foot below the surface of the roadway? That's the condition that I was hoping would happen, and I turned out to guess right. Now, what happened was, I saw in this newspaper that these cross-sectional drawings came off of something called the Nassau Water Commissioner's map from 1868, and the newspaper from 1911 said that they found this map from 1868 in the borough president's topographical office. So I went up to the topographical office the next day with this map from 1911, and I walk up to the borough engineer, and he's sitting there reading this paper, and he looks up at me, and he's like, "What do you want?" I said, "Well, can I see the Nassau Water Commissioner's map from 1868? So he looks up at me and he goes, "You aren't looking for that tunnel under Atlantic Avenue, are you?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." And he said, "There's no tunnel under there. Don't waste your time. I can guarantee to you there's no tunnel." I said, "Well, how do you know?" And he says, "Well, when I was your age, I went to look for it. There's nothing there." So I said, "Okay, that's all very nice and interesting, but where's this map from 1868? Can I see that?" And he says, "Well, we never actually found it." So I said, "Well, do you have a place where you keep really old things that no one ever looks at?" And he says, "Well, we have that wooden box up there on the top shelf, but, you know, it's way up on top, and the lock's broken. We don't have the key to it." I said, "Well, how about we'll carry it down and break the lock off with a screwdriver?" So he says, "Okay, we can do that." So we break open the lock to this box, and the first thing that comes out are the original deeds to Brooklyn from the Canarsie Indians with eagle feathers on them. And then under that is the original deeds from the Dutch farmers for Brooklyn from the 1600s. And then under that, there's a scroll, like a stick with a cloth map wrapped up around it. And we open it up and it says Atlantic Avenue Tunnel. So he's all shocked that this thing's sitting there under his nose all these years, and he never bothered to look in the box on top of the shelf. So he was very cool about it, and he made me a copy of it in this big blueprint machine that he had. So I took the map home and opened it up on my dining room table, and I looked at it for about 2 seconds, and I saw there was a cross-sectional view of the tunnel at Court Street, where it showed the roof of the tunnel was like a foot below the surface of the roadway. And then there was a corresponding blue dot at the longitudinal view, which I assume meant a manhole cover at the same spot. So I said to myself, if that blue dot's a manhole cover, it has to go inside that tunnel because it's like a foot below the surface of the roadway. So I'd never been here before, so the next day I came out here with the steel tape, and I was like following a treasure map. It was like 15 feet west and 30 feet north, and you're standing on top of this manhole cover in the middle of the roadway with nothing written on it and smaller than all the others. Not the same manhole that's there now, but in the same location. We changed it out for a bigger manhole cover when I got bigger. It didn't fit anymore. So that's where that manhole came from. Now, the first idea that I had when I saw this manhole cover in the street was call up my friend and have him come by with a tire iron and just pry the thing open and see what's inside. But then I happened to glance down the street and saw it was an 8-story building a block away with bars on the windows. So I said to myself, maybe it's not a good idea to open up manhole covers in front of the county jail. They'll think it's the Great Escape. So what I did instead was I went to the water department from the city. Now, the city water department was involved with trying to help me find a way in, but they chickened out after one day. So after them, I went to the gas company. Before it was National Grid or Keyspan or whatever it is now, it was originally called the Brooklyn Union Gas Company, and it's the same gas company that put the Litchfields out of business with their whale oil company in the 1850s. So I went to see Alan Smith, the Vice President for Public Affairs. And the reason I knew this guy